everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have Stephen Jenkinson with us, the founder of Orphan Wisdom and author of Die Wise and Come of Age, the case for elderhood in a time of trouble. We were supposed to have a session with Stephen at the Stoa a month ago, and the title is called Where Are the Elders? And then there was a scheduling mix-up, and then Stephen wasn't here. We didn't know where he was, and so it was very poetic. Us sitting in the Stoa in silence, wondering where the elders are. So I didn't want to jinx this session, so I changed the title called Finding the Elders, and I think we found at least one here today. Stephen is with us. Welcome to the Stoa.
Thank you, Peter. I should say that right off the top, that I'm the author of. We picked this up from the printer this morning. So that's how fresh it is. I hope it's dry. It's called A Generation's Worth. It's not, I mean, this is the very first time it's seen the light of day, or I've talked about it on any forum of any kind. We haven't even announced it yet, but there it is for those of you faithful people who tuned in. And it's even illustrated. That's a first for me. It's a beautiful thing. Hardcover, it's the real deal. Yeah.
Would you like to give us a kind of summary or preview what it's about?
Oh man, if I could summarize it, I wouldn't have had to write it, obviously, but the gist of it is this. In a 2-month period from the end of January to the end of March, I did a series of sessions about, I called a generation's worth, which was themed very much along the lines of what the piece you just played. I took each one of the books that I'd written and fed it through the meat grinder of the plague to see whether or not there was anything in what I have done in the last 15 years that mattered at all in these days, given everything. And it was an alive thing. So as I was making the notes to prepare for it, I began to notice that there's something compelling to me about the notes I was making. And before I knew it, I was assembling a book from the notes of preparation and the transcript of the session itself, and a PS that I call the aftermath of each one of the sessions. And it's each one of them are dated, so it's a document of a kind. It's a plague document in real time that was not meant to be exhaustive. Or as I put it, I went for brevity and I ended up with severity, it seems, instead.
Yeah, I like that. Plague document.
Plague document, yeah.
And so I allowed the group to decide what the first question would be. And this one comes up, the elders, who are they? Where are they? What do they know?
Who are they? Where are they? And what do they know? I mean, we're talking in the absence of, so these questions don't have much content. We could make all kinds of allegations about them, but they beg for description, those questions, and there's not a lot to describe. So we're in the position of having to prescribe instead, which is a challenging circumstance because it's a matter of trying to imagine beyond the poverty that you were born to, or use the poverty you were born to as a prompt for your imagination, something like this. Well, the first order of business is that an elder is not a person. It's not a personality type. It's not a kind of person. An elder is not the person who makes you feel better than you'd feel otherwise, or better about yourself than you have reason to. An elder is by definition a function that occasionally inhabits a person. And then when the function is more or less faithfully attended to, it moves on. The claim that it makes upon the elder moves on, if you will. So the elder's fundamental responsibility is to put themselves out of a job, you see, by democratizing the practice wisdom that's available to them by dint of the fact that they have been diminished during the course of their life, and the diminishment has deepened them. So it is not a recipe for a satisfying third act of your personal play to be an elder, particularly in a time like this, which is so egregiously elder-free that it's not clear. How should I put this? It's not clear to me, at least, that elders are, on the whole, called for. They might be a program heaped upon them as a group by virtue of their disappearance or their absence from the scene. But that's a little different from a plea for their appearance. I think that's a very uncommon event now. And the principal reason for that has to be, how can anyone let themselves in for making a plea for something they have no direct experience of and hope to get anything from the exercise, but in a deepened sense of futility and a sense of that no good is possible? I mean, I know the picture I'm portraying here is by and large a grim one. Well, if there's an elder function among us, it's to be a faithful witness to the times. A cheerleader is not an elder. So in a time like this, an elder's first responsibility is not to blink and to make sure that the times and the nature of the times are present whenever the elder's present. So if you're looking for a break from the action, an elder's not a place to go, you see, because the elder will oblige you to rejoin the fray by virtue of their example, not their teaching, if you will, their example instead. They're exemplars much more, they're practitioners much more than they are teachers, I would say. I mean, perhaps that's, oh, and where are they? I think that was the third one. Well, they're in other countries, they're in other cultures. The people who would be of the generation that you would expect elderhood to emerge from themselves very likely did not have elders attached to them through their early years. So you're looking at a compound fracture of a kind of cultural continuity when it comes to elders for us. Well, us, I say Anglo-North America, and other people can include themselves in that fray if they'd like. And the sadness of the whole arrangement is, I believe we've more or less come to a time when it's not clear to me that elders are missed, that people are just going down the roll call of generational availability, right? So the geezers are no more and have no particular use and deeply discredited. And so we're down to the late middle-aged people, and we'll see if they can endure the scrutiny of the youth. And when they're not able to do so any longer, we may end up with middle age. And before you know it, we'll be looking for elders in their 30s.
That's interesting, because that was the question that was kind of alive for me coming into this. It's how to prepare to be an elder, because I'm 36, and I notice a lot of young men in their 20s are looking at me saying, like, for wisdom and things like that. And I don't know what the fuck is going on. Like, I don't know what to do. But I have a desire to prepare to be a good elder. Yeah, so I'm curious what your thoughts on that.
Okay. To answer the question properly, it'd be worthwhile wondering what what's your expectation of preparedness? What would you reasonably expect to be able to pull together if you answered to the term prepared to be an elder? My guess is, generally speaking, well, I'll give you a riff from the death trade in the times when I was working there. People would often talk in terms of being prepared for their death or ready to die or things of that kind. Generally speaking, being ready to die was 4/5 a sense of futility, purposelessness, and having hit the wall. So this is not exactly what you would expect preparedness to deliver to you, but that's indeed one of the active ingredients of that. The other thing that dying people tended to expect from being prepared to die was that it would make dying a kind of non-event, a no big deal kind of thing. In other words, preparedness is more often than not taken to be a kind of assuredness, a kind of insurance that you take out against the slings and arrows and the vagaries and so on. Well, there is no preparing yourself, if that's what preparedness means, for an unprecedented event in your life. There is no preparedness. You should not be able to inure yourself to the particulars of the time so thoroughly that they resemble most of the other times that you've had. So there's the irony goes something like this. I had an employee once who was teaching on the side. And so I asked her, what is it that she's teaching? She said, well, the stuff we're learning from you. I said, well, what would that be? And she said, well, the principal thing is I'm teaching them how to get comfortable with their discomfort. You put that on a t-shirt, you could sell 1 million of them, right? Get comfortable with your discomfort. Yeah, that sounds good. That's very user-friendly. It's got to work. No downside that I can see. Well, how about this? What's it selling? The idea of being comfortable with your discomfort. It's selling comfort, isn't it? That's what it's selling. It's not selling discomfort. It's rejigging comfort so it even works when you're uncomfortable. You have recourse to the soothing balm, which is comfort. Translation: the only way you can get comfortable with the discomfort around dying is to pretend it's no big deal, or it's like 1 million other things you've been through. In fact, it's uncharted territory, and you have no business being comfortable in such a time. Well, we're in such a time, culturally speaking, there's no doubt. And the idea of being ready for it, if it means comfort, it should be disqualified. You could rather say you could grow some kind of capacity for the radical discomfort which has been the plague. Some capacity for it doesn't mean you're any less uncomfortable or at sea, but you know somehow a little bit how to be at sea in a way that a newcomer may not. But you're both still wet, you see.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
All right. So feel free to start putting your questions in the chat, and I'll click on you to unmute yourself. Kevin, you're up.
Hey, Stephen.
Hello, Kevin.
How you doing? I'll
Great.
I'll ask my last question because it's most relevant. Instead of trying to be comfortable with discomfort, because that sort of reframes everything as comfort, what about like courage as a sort of catch-all trait that can be applied to sort of going into the unknown and preparing for radical discomfort and unexpectedness?
Right. Well, it's a good question, and Joseph Campbell would be proud of you for asking it. Right. So, as you might guess, I have a different take on it than perhaps you might expect. So, see what you think. What's the prerequisite or prerequisites for bravery or courage? The bottom line, to my mind, it goes something like this. Well, there is a circumstance wherein there is a choice to be made. There is a choice that's available to you, which is a second order of that reality. And you choose. Okay, and hopefully you choose in a way that's life affirming and those other high-end ingredients. But those three things are mandatory for courage to be manifest or bravery to be manifest, because it implies you could, of course, choose not to choose. You could opt out. You could pretend you're choosing and not do so at all, and all the rest. Not much courage in there, you'd probably admit. So I think I've on occasion, I've been described in the terms that you're asking about. And I've had to object each and every time on that basis. And here's the basis. I've come very close to my own mortality frequently. It's a well-known commodity. It's a well-known stranger to me. Maybe I could put it that way. And the consequence has been, among others, that my life is lived in the presence of those glimpses. And as such, most of my choices have been taken from me. For example, my choice to be able to proceed blithely as if none of this will come to me. None of it will come to pass. I can live as if I'm going to live, for example. Well, that's all gone. Second order of reality to that is I don't have many peers with whom I can live out the reality of the oncomingness of my end. See, I don't get invited to many parties. You wouldn't either if you had these attributes. Long story short, the point I'm making here is I'm not a brave person given all of that. Why? Because I don't have those choices I just described to you. I'm living out the consequence of being in my grace period, personally speaking, health-wise, and the rest. And there's not a lot of wiggle room in your grace period. Don't get me wrong, you can still be an idiot, okay? And I find a way to do so. I find a way to forget all this. But sooner or later, I'm reminded again, hopefully within the day or two of forgetting. And those reminders deliver me back to the choiceless choice to behave as if what's bound to be is bound to be, and then to try to translate that into direct action. Like sitting here talking with you folks now, that's my translation to direct action. And the writing is another one. And if we get to tour again with the band, it's another one, and so on. So I don't see that courage or bravery has its place if you fully inhabit the consequences of the life that you've lived so far. I mean, it's not bad as a character option, but if you're of few choices because of what you've seen, then it's just a matter of whether you're faithful or obedient to what you've seen. What did Bob Dylan say on this matter? As a young man, he said, "To live outside the law, you must be honest." It's a beautiful undertaking, an enormously challenging idea. My translation of that is, if you live inside the law, if you're a law-abiding person, then your only obligation is to obey, not to fundamentally challenge the nature of the obedience or what you're being obedient to, but just to understand the law as best as you can and obey it. If you live outside the law, obedience is not available to you. And he said, this is where your honesty finally appears. And I would take out that understanding of honesty and plunk in courage there and say that courage requires the possibility of things being otherwise. And if you don't have that, as I don't, then you're simply faithful to what you've seen. And that's who's talking to you now, somebody who's by default faithful to what he's seen.
Do you have a quick reflection, Kevin?
Well, my internet just totally crapped the bed like halfway, so I missed like half of that. So I didn't really have any choices there. But I'll watch it later when it's on YouTube, and maybe I can. Yeah, thank you. That's great.
Okay.
Margaret, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Stephen, I'm wondering what you have noticed are conditions that are conducive or supportive to the function of elderhood arising.
You know, this is startlingly easy question to answer at the entry level. The first and last order of business when it comes to an enabling environment for elderhood is that the elder is taking marching orders from the culture, which is to say that the culture is elder tutored or elder educated in a fundamental and ongoing way. Thirdly, that the culture employs the elderhood of the elder in an almost routine way. So it endorses elderhood and it employs the consequences of the presence of elderhood in its midst. Let me draw a parallel with artists, for example. It seems to me that one of the characteristics of art, the artistic function in a more or less free society, is not self-expression. The artist's fundamental responsibility is to attest to the times that he or she is born to, such that when the culture loses its way in a troubled time, the way is available through the artwork. I shouldn't say the way. Ways are available through the artwork, you see. And the principal caveat here is the artist has a profound obligation to refract the nature of the times into its constituent parts so that the culture sees itself in action. But the artist has no responsibility to complement or to encourage or to traffic in hope where that culture is concerned. The first order of business is to testify faithfully to the times. You could draw a very sharp parallel, I think, with elderhood. That's elderhood's principal responsibility, and the difference between the artist as a younger person, maybe, and an elder as an older person would be the consequences of the accumulation of the time spent by the elder in the troubled time he or she was born to.
Any reflection, Margaret?
I'm reflecting that when I hear that, what comes up for me is having some context around what I've seen around frustration of those who are inhabiting that elder function, but perhaps haven't found a way to express it or have it received, of like they haven't found space for it to kind of move through them, and noticing the stagnation that comes up when there isn't that cultural kind of context for it to really unfold.
Exactly. So you're responding to the dilemma that ensues when the sponsoring culture, if we can call it that, is bereft of the cultural continuity that makes elderhood make sense and turns elders into positivity generating machines, you see. And then the older person feels obliged to be a kind of ongoing therapist, if you will, to the culture, or an ongoing catharsis merchant, right? And every time they're around, everybody who represents the culture at a given moment gets to partake of some kind of, magic karma wisdom that inevitably ensues from their presence. And the truth of the matter is, wisdom in a troubled time is troubling. It's not the way out of trouble, it's the way in. See? And finally, this is what the word catastrophe actually means, etymologically speaking. This is called the Stoa, so at least one etymology is mandatory. So here we go. So we have two parts to the word. The first part is Greek, and it's a preposition, and it answers the question, where, in terms of direction. And the answer it gives is down and a little bit in, but it's plummet and entry. So you already get an understanding of the architecture of catastrophe from the direction of the first part of the word. It's telling you there's something mandatory and inevitable about the oncomingness of descent. Okay, that's the first part. In other words, it's beginning to whisper that it may not be such a catastrophic thing for catastrophe to visit you. In other words, the bad PR that has accrued to catastrophe is leading us away from what catastrophe is promising or bearing. And then the root word is a technical word from music theory and from literature to a certain extent. It's an outdated word now for the most part, but it's a kind of versification, if you will. But its much older meaning is something which has been assembled or gathered, as in melody and harmony, for example, assembled or gathered or woven or braided. All of those are implied in the word strophe, okay? Reassemble the word, and what is a catastrophe now? It is a way down and into the mysteries of life that is prepared for you by those who came before you, who you will not meet when it's your turn to descend, but you will see the evidence of their precedents before you. They have literally processed down this way, and their hard times made a way for you to follow. See? So now think of the consequence of people your age throwing tradition under the bus at every opportunity they get, and ask yourself, what hope could there possibly be for the redemptive power of catastrophe when you've no willingness to align yourself with anything that has preceded you? And that is a recipe for literally an elder-free environment when it's your turn to be my age.
Wow. Thanks, Margaret. Evan, you got the next question.
So you almost answered part of it already in your responses to other people. So I'll try to elaborate a little bit. When I was first hearing you speak to Peter about this in the beginning of this session, it sounded like I felt a pretty deep resonance between the things you were talking about with eldership and the concept of a lineage, being a part of a lineage, being an inheritor of a lineage, something like that. And so I was going to ask you to speak generally about that, but maybe I'll make it a little bit more specific since I kind of feel that you already did. So I'm wondering, I have a sort of pet theory that with the, I don't know, with the Industrial Revolution or something like that, that we stopped valuing the sort of skills that were passed down from older people and started valuing only the skills that didn't exist when older people were in their prime. And that this was a big cultural shift or something like that that might be related to the lack of eldership. So I'm wondering if you probably have very interesting and sophisticated thoughts around that topic. So just anything that seems relevant there, I'm really curious to hear your views on that.
That's a very good observation you make, that there's something about the advent of modernity which puts younger people at odds with their seniors. So see what you think of this. We have a thing that's been dubbed the Anthropocene Era, the human-centered time, right? It's not to say that it's a good thing, but there it is. And one of the hallmarks of the Anthropocene era in the West is what we've been talking about the last half hour or so. One of the ways that this metabolizes is we have a circumstance that's on the increase from everything I've heard and seen amongst older people, known as neurodegenerative disorders or diseases, right? Okay. Now look what they attack. Look where the principal zone of affliction is, primarily in memory and secondarily in the capacity to retain a sense of sequence, which would corrupt your capacity for understanding meaning, because cause and effect would be corrupted. And I mean, it's a calamity without borders, frankly. Okay. The thing I'd like to point out is this affliction is coming to old people at exactly the same time as the advent of technological innovation makes their personal memories trinkets. You see? In other words, the culture does not draw down on their memory except for a museum exhibit or some kind of sepia toned, nostalgia, right? But by and large, the personal memory of the older person has gone the way of the rotary phone already. and 100 other ephemera. Okay. So, but alas, this is not only an affliction for older people, because I have it on good authority that younger people are undergoing something similarly plague-like in their numbers, known collectively as attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Where does this disorder locate itself? My answer, in the young person's capacity to apply themselves, which really speaks to their inability to give a shit about the ongoingness of the life around them, right? So you make a case about their potential and living up to it and so on, and it goes nowhere, right? Because the let's say the adhesive quality of mandate when it comes to applying yourself has no claim and can make no claim upon these younger people at exactly the same time that the culture around them buffets them with a degree of technological innovation that only asks them to pay attention to the most recent incarnation of anything. And these things are all ephemeral in and of themselves. So the irony is that the very young and the very old seem to me to have become, within my lifetime, sentinel species for the Anthropocene West. And they're whispering involuntarily about demise, cultural demise, but they're manifesting it much more than they're testifying to it, because they're as much victims of it, if you will, as they are signs of it. But that's the first thought I have in response to the parallel you drew, and grim stuff. Yeah.
Any reflection, Evan?
Yeah, I'm just feeling into the sense of heaviness and a bit of sadness, I guess, there, that we, like, older people are where the stories live, and we seem to just create warehouses to store them somewhere out of sight and out of mind, and just feeling into that. So, yeah.
Okay, so let's go one step further now with what you've just said. I'm sounding like the MC now, but I'll grab it in a way. So on the early days of the plague, all over the Western world, one of the places that COVID-19 grabbed a hold of the population and didn't let go was the very places you just mentioned, so-called old folks' homes, right? Okay, so there's a lot of dynamic and sort of employment record reasons that happened the way it did. But the principal reason that it happened the way it did is that there's such a thing. That's why it happened like it did, okay? That there's such a thing as warehouses for older people who've outlived their usefulness, see? And their memories are of no use to nobody. So if we could have learned anything from the plague from early on that's redemptive, it would have been something like this: free your old people from those shackles and reroute and rejig your understanding of what your middle age is for, to include them, instead of working a few more hours a week to pay for the sequestering of them so you can have a geezer free time of it. See, I'm going out on a limb here, but I'm going to guess that the principal reason there's old folks' homes is because middle-aged people in their peak income generating time can't afford to care for the people who cared for them when they were kids and make the money to care for everything else at the same time. It's a monstrous arrangement, and it's a guarantee for an elder-free existence for every oncoming generation. So the kids are born into a time, the infants now and the young children are born into a time where you have to go find these people, right? You have to go visit them on visiting days. Until recently. Now you can't do that. And you have to find a way to not feel strange in their presence, or that they're the strangers because they're locked away here. Can you imagine the associations that young people have? Well, that's the only access they have to their grandparental generation. And these people are locked away in some kind of place they cannot leave. I mean, the so-called meta narrative of this thing is diabolical.
Thank you, Evan. Ari, you had a question.
Yo. Yeah, it's almost that the question has been answered here, and I have so many thoughts about it as we've spoken, but the question's essentially, it sounds like we could look at this from two different places of why people aren't embodying elderhood, and the other one of essentially why kids don't want to listen to elders. What has broken the two sides of this relationship? And what you just said about people being stuck in old folks' homes and the associations that I've made as a kid growing up to see my grandparents just stuck in old folks' homes, like, what could they tell me? What are other things that may have broken the intergenerational transmission here?
Well, I wasn't there for all of it. So I'm having to assemble the broken shards of a cup just to be able to get some kind of nourishing drink, you see, and I'm missing at least half of them. So I have to catch the rainwater of the way it is, just enough to quench my thirst to be able to keep going. Obviously, I'm speaking metaphorically, but I think you take what I'm saying. Okay, one of the principal things that has happened is fairly recent in terms of, not geological time, but human time. And it goes like this. If I said to you, respect your elders, you knew that I didn't come up with that. That's been around an awful long time. Okay. Let's wonder about it, because I'm going to suggest to you there's a missing other half to it that nobody ever says. But let's come to it slowly. So when you say respect your elders, what are you saying? Are you describing something, or prescribing something, or proscribing something? Let's see. Let's wonder about it. If you're describing something, you're describing a culture at doing its elder endorsing work. Respect your elders. Okay? There's no argument in the declaration. There's no contentiousness, right? There's no sense of brailing your way towards something. There's no lostness in it. It doesn't say, there's no conditional phrase, respect your elders if you can find them. Respect your elders if they'll still sit still long enough for you to respect them, or respect your elders provided you know what respecting elders should still look like. It doesn't, none of those things are there. So it comes from a time when elderhood was basically intact as a functioning social event. So it was describing the weather, the prevailing sentiment and kind of cultural weather of the times. Now, something happened, and I think that something can be traced almost verbally, as is my wont, and it would be this. Just as the biblical quote, money's the root of all evil, leaves out a certain part that makes the quote easier to say, easier to apply, easier to inflict. In the case of the Bible, the actual quote is, "For I tell you, it is the love of money which is the root of all evil." In other words, it does not locate the problems with money in money. It locates the problems in our relationship with money, in our utility with money. In other words, it locates the dilemmas inside us. Okay, and money takes a terrible beating when you take out the love of, and you just say money's the root of all evil. And this is the way towards a kind of psychic puritanism that means nobody no good. So that's a piece that's missing when it's used in the popular culture to denigrate money people, for example. By the same token, something's missing with that phrase, respect your elders. And I'm going to suggest to you it's this: respect your elders as they conduct themselves respectably. It's not a conditional phrase. It's still a descriptive phrase. As they, not if they, or should they, or as long as they. In other words, if you reunite the two phrases, you don't have an out clause for the younger generation who's not getting what it wants from the older people and basically flips them the bird. The phrase says, respect your elders as they conduct themselves respectably. In other words, there's a kind of reciprocity in the arrangement, and respect is the currency of that reciprocity. It's a kind of mutually sustaining spirit, let's say. So what happens? I don't know which ended first. It's not clear to me that, the powers that be had a meeting and decided they were done with elderhood because they'd given it a good shot and now they were going to try middle age instead. Who knows exactly what it was? And there's no such thing as a certain specific something that occurred, but overall, there was some fundamental compromise brought to bear upon older people's inclination and capacity to engender the respect of their juniors. Largely, I think it has to do with, an earlier question pointed to it, between the advent of the public education system and the Industrial Revolution and the loss of children's ongoing encounter with their parents at work, that segregation. There's a lot of the parental and the grandparental life that was taken away from kids. They didn't have exposure to it. They had to imagine what they did at work, what the older people did at work. And then they had to imagine what kind of worthwhileness attached itself to older people because they couldn't see it for themselves. Somewhere in there, the fundamental psychic utility of older people became a rumor rather than a state of affairs. And as soon as it becomes a rumor, it becomes negotiable. And as soon as you don't get what you want from the older generation, the way is wide open to say, well, they haven't earned it from me, as if it's the obligation of a 70-year-old person to conduct themselves in such a way to earn your regard. See, that's a big thought to think now, because everybody listening can point to handfuls of examples where older people fundamentally let them down. And generationally speaking, all of us can point to climate change and a host of other dilemmas that all occurred on the watch of people who are now old. Okay, there's no negotiating that away. That's true. So one of the fundamental dilemmas that people your age and younger have to contend with is this. Now that you have sorted out your feelings of betrayal when it comes to older people, what shall you do? Shall you betray them as you yourself have been betrayed? Will this even the score? Will this make it better? Will this put the emphasis where it properly belongs, on the restorative powers that exist within young people? Don't forget, the people in places where elderhood is an ongoing reality, nobody would be of the view that people in their teens and 20s and even in their 30s are capable of filling in for elders should they stray. Nobody would think such a thought. Okay. And yet this is a thought that we come up with fairly routinely. I'll give you an example, if I'm not taking up too much time here. So I'm down putting the finishing touches on the Come of Age book and I'm in a bar in Oaxaca in Mexico, the city of Oaxaca. And I end up talking with a woman, I'm going to guess maybe 30, 32 years old. And she says, the standard question, so what do you do? And I haven't been in a bar for a long time. So, I've forgotten how this all works. And so I thought she's asking me. So like an idiot, I try to answer the question, what do I do? And one of the things I mentioned was I was working on this book. I didn't talk too long, but obviously it was still too long, whatever it was. And she said, elderhood, a book about elderhood. I said, yeah. She said, in exactly this tone, she said, why? So you can hear the fix is in already, but I'm slow, to take up the hint. So I answered her question about why. I said, well, I think something happened to the current generation of older people on their way to being old that compromised their ability to be elders. I didn't even get the whole sentence out. And she cut me off. She said, oh, I know what happened. Wisdom abandoned people your age. We've got it now. If there were ever a sign of the utter absence of elderhood in a 30-year-old's lifetime, that's the sign, that declaration. So I don't say that out of, with any sense of triumph it was sadly, it was as much a testimonial for what's gone missing as anything I could have come up with on my own. Finally, sorry, last thing about it, not last thing, but elderhood is a kind of fundamental rejigging of the circuitry. Okay, that's why I said it's not a person. So when elderhood has its way with older people in a functioning culture, they're almost involuntarily unable to fuck up too severely, if I could put it this way, because the tempering presence of the elderhood they themselves were exposed to, has that power in their lives. You see, the elders that they grew in the presence of are larger in their lives when they themselves become elders than their own personalities are. I think I said that pretty clearly. That's just what I mean. So the kind of savage reconstitutive power of elderhood is that it short circuits your entropic capacity for self-absorption. In other words, to use more handy language, if you're subjected to elderhood as a young person, you stand a distinct possibility of becoming a citizen, not a person.
Any reflections, Barry?
Yeah, like a million. But I think, and I feel like I'm towing the line of follow-up question, but there's some delineation here that we haven't yet made between age and wisdom and elderhood. Because it doesn't seem clear to me that elderhood is always delineated by age. And I think one of the things that you mentioned, the respect your elders, basically comes off with like an ageism thing as growing up, that basically means that your authority is everyone who's older than you.
Well, I think in a functioning culture, that's basically accurate. You see, but when that becomes, when you say it plaintively, as you have just done, or argumentatively, if I've heard your tone correctly, it's a sign of what was never there. You see, now everything's up for grabs because there's no inherent merit that accrues to an older person, which is exactly what you've just pointed out, right? So since you've gone to a supplemental question, let me supplement my answer then with a little bit more, something like this. For most of human history, the advent of more old people in our midst per square foot than usual carried a certain meaning. Okay, I'm going to contrast it with now. It carried a certain meaning. And the meaning basically went like this. Well, there's enough food, There's good shelter. It's the old Maslow's hierarchy thing. We're not on the run. Persecution is at a record low, and lo and behold, we have a lot of babies that in numbers we didn't see before, and we have people living longer. What does it mean? It means that we're doing pretty well. And the presence of more old people in our midst is a manifest sign that times are good. Okay. There's the wisdom that you mentioned and other things as well. But at the fundamental existential level, that's what it meant for most of human history. Just as when there was very few elders in your midst, it generally meant that you're living on fumes and just getting by, like in times of war or famine or things of this kind. You see? Okay, what have we got now? We got more elders per square foot. No, excuse me, more old people per square foot than we've probably ever had. Okay, what does it mean? Well, Monsanto has seen to it that there's enough cheap food to go around, right? So they're not dying of starvation or malnutrition. In fact, it's not that easy to die as an old person in the West anymore. You kind of have to go out of your way to find a way to get taken down by something. Because failing that, you'll just linger. Okay, what does it mean? It means that we got more old people per square foot than we can possibly employ given the current regime and its predilections. Okay. So from this, we realize the point that you've made, that there is a distinction to be made, and an important one, between experience and wisdom. Okay. Raw experience, the blunt force trauma of an ordinary day, does not in and of itself translate into wisdom if you just can amass enough ordinary days and, get out of your 50s. That's not what wisdom is. And this is a long, long discussion. But the point I guess I'm making is, if we can distinguish between aged and elder, we can do so on the basis of a distinction between experience and wisdom, understanding that there's a thing called prejudice, which is a transferable affliction from generation to generation. Wisdom, on the other hand, seems clearly to me not to be transferable. That is, there's something site-specific, so demandingly particular about wisdom that it is remarkably and faithfully a child of its times. And as such, the content of the wisdom cannot be passed on from one generation to the next more or less uncritically. You see? So when young people sit there with their arms folded, rejecting in principle anything that preceded them, that's what they're doing. They're mistaking the wisdom that they're expecting from the prejudice that they've grown accustomed to. The idea being that if the wisdom of their elders was anything like it's cracked up to be, it would instantly translate to the younger person as being utilizable, relevant, and unbesmirchable. None of which it is. That's what prejudice has, all those things going for it. Prejudice is inherently, it comes with the mother's milk. Wisdom comes with the spirit labor of a given generation, which is why I called that book, the new book, A Generation's Worth, because it's the spirit work of a given generation that I'm making a claim for now, and using the current plague as a template, if you will, or a kind of prism to wonder about that. Well, obviously there's lots more where that came from, but over to you.
Thank you, Ari. Yeah, it feels like a good place to close. We're at the top of the hour.
No kidding. I was just getting warmed up.
Would you like to field one or two more questions?
Why not?
All right.
Let's do one more, and let's make it a doozy along the lines of all the other ones.
All right. I think Pat, you had a doozy question. Would you like to ask it?
Oh, yeah, that was me. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
I'm 73, so along with thinking about my death every single day, I think about what does it really mean to be an elder, because I feel that my age tells me that I'm an elder, but certainly my wisdom is something that I earn every day. My question to you is, I really want you to give me a personal experience of what has it felt like for you, Stephen, to be in the company of an elder. Um, and did you take care of your parents as they died?
Okay, the first part. Luckily, I don't have to look very hard or very long to answer the question about what was it like? What was the prevailing emotional weather of the time? It was suffocating. When I think back on it now, I remember having a degree of dismissive enmity towards this man that I could barely stomach, because at some part of me knew it was wrong in some way, but it was insurmountable at the time. Why? Well, because the guy was amazing. That's why. He was so categorically capable of being a human being. And in particular, he was a master of tragedy. And he was a storyteller. So he's a public performer. And I was his band. So I toured a lot of North America with him and his wife. And there were many times when I literally felt like I couldn't breathe in his presence, because he took up so much room, you see. And he had so much consequence, which is, of course, the reason I was there in the first place. So the old thing about, be careful what you long after or what you pray for or what you wish for, it came in spades. And it was all but unlivable, because I suffered by comparison, didn't I? Of course I did. I had no capacity that I could cling to in order to, that my sense of myself could somehow endure this radiation. Well, that's the point, that your sense of self is not supposed to be able to endure the radiation of a for real elder. Okay. In the absence of a culturally endorsed experience of initiation at puberty and so on, if you have any chance at all, something or someone comes along slightly later than your puberty and unseats you so desperately and so ruthlessly, with no malice and no intention to do so. And they can do so basically without much risk to themselves, because they don't have any skin in the game of your development as a human being. What they do have is an investment in adding to the citizenship of the body politic. And that's what he did. I should say he was and remains Black, and I clearly am otherwise. And so there was a lot of those dynamics going on at the same time. And I can't overstate the grim good fortune that brought me to his attention in the first place. And we ended up in a kind of undeclared apprenticeship arrangement, you could say, where today I bear no resemblance to his accomplishment, but I can on a good day claim his influence. See, but the only way his influence has stayed with me is that I didn't stay with me. That was how severe his consequence was for me. But nobody would have known this looking, right? Because it was a very affable looking arrangement. But I knew what I was contending with inside. And that I found him so unassailably capable of three-dimensional humanity. And I knew I had no similar capacity. And I'm on the same stage with him at the same time, being introduced by him as his son and things of this kind. So it was a marvelous thing. And I could, I'm careful what to wish for other people, because that is that was a remarkably hard experience to endure. When I finally walked away after intermittent time of 7 years off and on, I immediately entered a period of destitution. 10 full years of living in the desert, meaning I could not find a way in my ordinary life to translate what I had seen and what I'd been entrusted with and what I'd been charged with as a result of being with him. And that was almost unlivable. So as hard as it was to be with him, obviously the next 10 years were virtually undoable. And I had to, as I can realize now, come to my mid 40s before I managed to live out what I had been led into. So I'm not talking about nothing. I'm not talking about ideas. I'm translating many of the things that I had to try to come to understand without a lot of tutorials on the matter. And this is why when I hear people longing after being an elder and so on, I'm not saying that's the only example. I'm saying it's the one I saw. And it's as trustworthy an example as anything in life that I've seen before or since. And I'm very, very careful about responding to the expectation of the uninitiated in these regards. You're old enough to remember a time where the obligation to anybody who occupied any place in university or even in public office was to be relevant. That was a huge word in the late 60s. You had to be relevant in the early 70s. And who was adjudicating the relevance? 19 to 22-year-olds. If there were ever a sign of the lack of initiation and elderhood, that would be it. So it's very difficult, no? We're living in a time now where elders are literally not called upon structurally in the culture. Structurally, no. Individually, desperately, yes, but structurally, no. How then are older people ever supposed to understand what the thing looks like, how it unfolds in the ordinariness of a human encounter? I mean, it's an enormously challenging time to live out, you know, and I write a 400-page book and I barely get started with the issue. Work to be done. That's what it means. Work to be done, right? And not looking to young people for a thumbs up on what the work is. How would they know? They might have some response, quote, when they see it. But the approval of a very young person is much different than the deep running education of an elder. So as an older person, seeking out the approval of young people it's a tricky business. It's a tricky business because, you know, the cost that's attached to the approval of a young person has a lot to do with satisfying their expectations. But where do their expectations of an older person come from? Generally speaking, they come from a regime of frustration and betrayal. Well, it doesn't end there, but I mean, it's good to know that if we begin with the poverties of the time, we don't betray anyone. If we begin with the helium of affirmation and hopefulness, betrayal is in the wings waiting to be introduced.
Any final reflections, Pat?
Well, I love the word reciprocity. And I love to think of my life in terms of more circular versus linear. And when you mentioned the whole idea of an elder waiting for some kind of approval from the younger generation, I certainly don't look at it that way, because I feel that, for me at least, the whole notion of interbeing with the younger generation. I mean, I love being with young people. and I'm very curious about their world. Like right now, as we speak, I have a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old who are here at my home because their father almost died. So I get to rub up against who they are and see them within their generation. So, I mean, I think my responsibility, I feel, is having this deep, deep, deep respect, for the qualities of the intergenerational, the inner being. And I feel like that's what's missing. Oops, my stupid phone just rang. Anyhow, I really honor your work, Stephen. I'm sorry.
If you're back, Pat, you're muted.
I'm sorry. I don't know how much you heard, but the phone just rang. Anyhow, it's a complicated time. And I think that the internet and what I see these kids being bombarded with so much information, I can really resonate with what you're saying, Stephen, about the ADHD. It's so much they're dealing with.
Yeah.
Anyhow, that's just my reflection.
Thank you, Pat. So we'll close out here. I'll make some closing announcements in a moment. But Stephen, would you like to leave us with any words?
I think I have. I think that's what the last hour and change has been. If you can summarize up an hour and a half, you didn't need the hour and a half, right? So I never do that summarizing thing. I just say that I may sound adamant. I probably do. In fact, I know I do. What you're hearing is the sum total of the consequence of this particular mayhem that has made itself known to me over the decades. I don't advocate this as a style for anybody else to emulate, but nor do I think that there's anything to be, the hard edges to be taken off. I would just say this, though. There is, the word blessing I don't think has come up today, so I'll end with this and say that in an unsophisticated moment, younger people might confess that they're longing after some kind of blessing from an older person, even in spite of themselves, challenged as they may be to hold it dear or to believe in it. But still, this doesn't prevent them from longing after it. And there's something in older people that clearly longs after the blessing of younger people. Once you realize blessing is not approval, you're getting somewhere. It's recognition, first and foremost. And I should say, as a closing etymology, that the word bless, our verb to bless, comes from an old Proto-Germanic word for blood. It means to bloody, as in sacrifice, as in the making of sacrifice. That's what blessing actually is. It's the going, gone of what preceded that moment. That's what a blessing is. So you could sum the whole thing up, if you were inclined, and say, you seek after the blessing of an older person? I do. Then bless them, because that's how you dislodge it. Bless an older person and be blessed thereby. And the reciprocity that the woman just before spoke to is there. It's not approval, though. It's much more profound. So bless on everybody who's listening, and hopefully some of it comes my way too.
And I think I can speak on behalf of the people here at the Stoa that we send our blessing to you, Stephen. Yeah, I'm leaving feeling very heavy and very nourished. So thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
You're welcome. Listen to that record. That's going to help with that heavy feeling. You listen to that Rough Gods record that we did, Gregory and I, you're going to see this contended with very directly.
Hmm.
You know, I'm not pretending there's anything about this easy to hear or to consider. It's heavy like nobody's business. If it's heavy for you, imagine the weight for me in trying to find a way again to put this into a language that makes it accessible without stupefying anybody in so doing.
Hmm.
It's enormously challenging, no? But why are we here in a time like this? So anyway, I think the record might it hurts in the right way. How about that?
And I think for closing out, we'll listen to it and love to have you back, Stephen. And
You ask, I'm there.
beautiful, beautiful.
Okay. Thanks
All right,
again.
take care.
Thanks, folks. Thank you.